we're looking at the second part of the asbestos section. And again, we want you guys to be able to explain what damage asbestos can do to our health, which we have covered already in the first half. Identify where asbestos might be found in domestic properties. We're going to look at this in a lot of detail in this part of the PowerPoint. And explain the steps that you should take if you suspect the presence of asbestos. Essentially, you might find asbestos in any property built before 1999. Okay, asbestos was banned in 1999, so anything before the year 2000, essentially, you might find from 1999 sort of back. You might find asbestos, and asbestos was used, as we've said in the previous part, it's used everywhere. You might use it for fire protection, spray asbestos on into gaps, over steel beams to protect it from fire, for lagging or pipe insulation. In boilers, it's used regularly in older boilers, so be careful if you're taking apart older boilers. They've put it into gaskets and all sorts, you know. They used to use it for flues, for boiler flues, you know, make cement flues, mix asbestos in with the cement. Make it into board, insulation board for fire protection. Put it in ceiling tiles, as we saw in the last one as well, in floor tiles. Might use asbestos rope to seal the flues. And you also might come across it in water tanks in the loft. Cold water storage cisterns is the proper name for them. And as you can see, also there's an asbestos feed and expansion system, F&E system, which is used to feed the heat inside. So you can see asbestos cement water tank, asbestos cement flues. They also used asbestos cement corrugated roofing that we saw in the last part of this module as well. They also mixed it in with plaster to create sort of artex. When you make these, when you see these nice swirling patterns on people's ceilings, that's artex. And if it was done before 1999, there's a chance there might be asbestos mixed in with the plaster. So if you do come across it, rather than kind of knocking it off or removing it, you're probably better off to plaster over the top of it. Again, like we said, mixed in with the floor tiles, also in the backing of the floor tiles as well. And again, sort of certain products are higher risk than others. With asbestos cement products, they only actually have about 10% asbestos, so they are definitely a hazard if they become damaged, if you drill them or you hammer them. But because these fibres are locked into what we say locked into a matrix, the fibres aren't easily released and mixing with the cement. As long as it's undamaged, you're actually at very little risk. But if products contain a lot of asbestos, they should be removed by a licensed contractor. For lower risk things like the asbestos cement cisterns, a plumber could remove them, but they would have to take the asbestos cistern to a licensed waste disposal centre to have it sort of disposed of correctly. Which is essentially what we've talked about just here. So if you do suspect asbestos in something that you're working on or working near, report it to your supervisor, let them know straight away, and they should then sort of get it tested and make sure that people aren't put at risk from that activity. The sampling and testing of asbestos will be carried out by an appropriately sort of qualified person, essentially. You see it all here. Materials with this, well, all materials containing asbestos are potentially dangerous. If it's got high asbestos content, it's especially dangerous and should only be removed by a licensed contractor. And you can see this happening here. This would all be done actually under a slightly negative air pressure. That would means that essentially there's a bit of suction pressure on there. So even if there's any tears in this plastic sheeting, no air or particles will be blown out, and it will all be kind of kept contained within the any fibres will be kept contained within the plastic sheeting. Yeah, like I say, there are some exceptions to that rule. If the fibres are locked in a matrix, for example, in asbestos cement, then they're not considered as high risk, though you must not drill them or cut them, and you must, if you do remove them, you must take them to a licensed waste disposal centre to be dealt with. Obviously make sure, Amy, just hold on a minute please. Okay, obviously make sure that an appropriate risk assessment has been carried out before working on or near asbestos. A good way of reducing the risk further would be dampening down the area. That reduces the risk of fibres becoming airborne, and make sure not to damage the product, which will result in the release of the asbestos fibres. So asbestos was completely banned in 1999. Yeah. So yeah, there's no cure for asbestos related diseases. Make sure that you stay safe. It takes a long time from the point of inhaling asbestos to the potential breakout of the cancer. So make sure that you prevent yourself from breathing it in to start with. You're probably going to be most at risk houses built between the 50s and the 80s. That's when asbestos use was at its highest. But anything before 1999 and before, there's potentially a risk. And literally, asbestos was used everywhere, all over the house, like we've talked about, on the roof, on the gutters. You'd have asbestos cement gutters, the fascia boards, and the floor tiles, ceiling tiles, in the cisterns, plastic and cement in the attic, wagon, insulation, which is another way of saying insulation, in gas fires and boilers. You need to be super careful if you work in older properties. Okay. Now you've got a task to do. Good luck.